Let me tell you what we're going to do for next week before Herb gets up. One of the things we're going to do, Herb wants to give you more of a linear framework for how we got to where we are today. And so he's going to come and do that in a minute. But one of the things that David Barton alluded to was, going back to Genesis, that God had set up 3 institutions. Now, some of you may have been in a class that Herb and I did, what was it, 2 years ago, Herb? How many of you have ever seen this diagram before? Okay, so many of you have, all right. The homework for those of you who haven't, and even for those of you who have, is I want you to look up the scripture on the back and put it in the right circle on the front. Okay? The point being that those institutions were institutions, all 3 of them, government included, are institutions that were set up by God. And God defines, within Scripture, the primary roles and responsibilities and duties of each of those institutions. And one of the things that I would say is that in the church, we're pretty good at telling people or teaching people, here's the way the family ought to operate. Here's what it means to be a good father, here's what it means to be a good mother, all of that. We're pretty good about saying, here's how the church ought to operate. We have elders, we have deacons, so on and so forth. And here's how we operate. We have church discipline. Here's the doctrines that we teach. But we don't teach anybody about government, and what government ought to do, and what government ought not to do. And so if you haven't been through the class that we've done before, or you haven't had anything like this is your opportunity to teach yourself something about what government ought to do, and what government ought not to be doing. Because there are limitations. I mean, we kind of go through what Jesus says in the Gospels, where he says, you know, give unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And we like to quote Paul or Peter and John when they say we ought to obey God rather than men, but we really don't know how it works out. And so what I want you to do is to take some time this week to fill that out, you know, to figure out. And by the way, this is not an exhaustive list. This is the easy list, relatively speaking. All right? So this is the relatively easy list. I bet you didn't know the Bible has something to say about who should be citizens, did you? Okay. The Bible does. It has something to say about citizenship. And so it also has a lot to say about money. And so that's your task for the next week. Also next week we may have a guest speaker. One of the young ladies in our church has got a class at Multnomah, and she's supposed to do a presentation on postmodernism. And so we haven't worked out the details yet about whether she'll be here next week or the week following. So you may have 2 weeks to do this, but you may not. Okay. Hear anything today that was new to you from David Martin? Anything you hadn't heard before, weren't aware of? Stephen? Most of it was? Oh, the different tests that the Supreme Court has? Yeah. I find it funny, the first one's called the lemon test. Right. Yeah. The other thing is all these things are very much hot topics, ongoing. Okay? And just a couple of examples. Herb may allude to these, but one of the things that's happening is that you realize now that military chaplains have to have their prayers approved. Okay?
Is this new?
It's probably new within the last 10 years. Okay? But they have to have their prayers approved. They are not supposed to preach anything against, especially now with Don't Ask, Don't Tell, right? They can't preach against homosexuality if the Bible teaches against homosexuality. So that's another example. So when we talk about, government shouldn't be limiting people's expressions, Well, it does so all the time when you're dealing with the military. And as I mentioned a week ago, you can imagine, well, in a couple of other cases where hospitals are being required, or teaching hospitals may be required to teach abortion, for example. Okay? Or you wouldn't be able to be licensed as a doctor if you haven't been to through a teaching program to know how to do abortions. Herb has some interesting things too, I think, to say about how this might actually ultimately impact the bar, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of things where, and you can imagine how that might affect if Obamacare really does go into effect, right? About what chaplains might be able to say in a hospital. And so we need to, understand that we're in a war, okay? And it's a take no prisoners kind of war. And we need to be engaged. So Herb, you want to come and take us through the...
Doug, who's the one regulating, who's the one making the decisions on the chaplain's prayers?
I don't know if you can point to any specific place. I think you have just, government policy that starts getting put in place by those who are hostile to religion. Apparently there have been some chaplains who have actually been demoted because they've refused to let their prayers be regulated. So, there is a very hot battle going on right now.
There's another handout up here which I would encourage you to take. It was written back in 1995 by a friend of mine named Steve McFarland, who back before he was a big deal was a lawyer up in Seattle, and he went on to become the director of the Christian Legal Society Center for Law and Religious Freedom, and he went from there to be the first director of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and now he works for an organization called Advocates International, which has a lot of fairly notable people working alongside. But the reason I gave you the article is the title of it is something that 16 years later still resonates. It's called "The Establishment Clause Made Me Do It." And what he's talking about there is all the public officials who say, well, this really wouldn't be my first choice, but because this is religious and because it's separation of church and state, the Establishment Clause made me do whatever I'm about to do to religious expression. Okay? Now, there are some people who are absolutely, adamantly hostile to religious expression. There's more people who are saying, well, I don't really hate religious expression, but the Establishment Clause made me do it. So Steve, in his article, goes through a series of examples where it's like, well, in a secular context, this is okay, but in a religious context, it's not okay. And it's just, pretty soon it becomes the theater of the absurd. And so his article, in very, plain speak, talks about those kinds of situations. So I would encourage you to read it. It's as pertinent today as it was at the time that he wrote it, and I think it's really important for people to kind of understand how this all gets twisted around. In terms of well, first of all, how many of you know that there are two religion clauses before you watch David Barton? Everybody know there was two religion clauses? Okay. And, one of...
Establishment and the exercise?
Right.
Exercise, is that what you mean? Okay.
Yeah, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Okay? Now, the way that was traditionally taught in law school is those two clauses are at war with each other. That's how I learned the First Amendment. So it becomes this sort of balancing act where you try and figure out how to make sure you implement one clause without stepping on the toes of the other. Well, now, we're not even worried about whether it steps on the toes of free exercise. The only thing that matters is making sure there's not an establishment. Okay? Now, what I'm about to say, I want you to keep in mind as we talk about all the amendments in the Bill of Rights. Okay? They only regulate what Congress can do. In other words, what the federal government can say or do about individual rights. Okay? So if a private person comes up to you and says, you have no right to say your religious stuff around me, that's not a First Amendment violation because it's a private person acting. What we're talking about is the federal government acting. Okay? That's what the Bill of Rights is all about. And that gets applied to the states through the 14th Amendment, and I won't bore you with all of that right now, but the point to remember is we're talking about the federal government regulating things.